Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, interrogator for the Ordo Redactus, and I have finally been permitted to carry the Inquisitorial Rosette to prove such a thing. However, while the Rosette has been gene-locked to me, it wasn't painted at any point. So, let's get on and do that and have a closer look. For some context, we'll need to look to the Warhammer 40k universe, a science fiction setting where humanity has managed to achieve a galaxy-spanning empire of 1 billion worlds. As you can imagine from any human society that size, there is endless bureaucracy. And there are many organisations that administrate, police and guard the worlds of the Imperium. And highest among those is the Inquisition, formed of individuals, Inquisitors, who hold ultimate power, whose very word is law, and to disobey is unthinkable. As you can imagine, there will be some who would try to impersonate a person of such power, and therefore the Inquisitorial Rosette is used as a badge of office and proof of identification. Now, the Rosette can come in an infinite number of varieties and with an endless number of gadgets and extra features. But today we're just looking at the external appearance of such an object. So to start my design, I went and found quite a few reference images of Inquisitorial Rosettes, and I simply chose the one that I thought looked the best. Now, my 3D modelling skills are quite limited and mechanical in their purview, and so to make a design like the skull would be very difficult for me. Thankfully, a skull is a fairly common shape to find on such places as Thingiverse, and so I used that as a starting point and then built the rest of the Rosette around it. And finally, 3D printed, primed in black, and then let's have a look at the paint job. I'm planning to make a golden border, red panels, and the skull to be sort of realistic looking. But let's talk about this red, and about red paint in general, particularly over a black base coat. I have tried 2 different brands of red paint and they have both come out very much the same, patchy and awful. And so this is certainly going to require quite a few layers. But I tried to use some yellow to create a stippled effect. However, that didn't work and I ended up painting another layer of red over the top. I have no idea how many layers of red this required, but it was quite a few. The skull, however, while it did take quite a few layers, was a much more familiar process for me. There's a piece of advice that keeps floating around in the mini painting hobby, that you never paint black as black and you never paint white as white. Now in this case my black will be black because it's the shadows and it doesn't really matter to the look of the piece. However, the skull really should be some form of white, and so I painted it as a very light brown. I started with a tan and then I mixed the tan with white in increasing shades to get to the final look. And I did use a brown wash at one point, and then the final highlight layer went over that. The gold edging was far easier. That was simply a tan paint first to hide the black, a rose gold to give it some shine, and then the kind of more traditional gold colour over the top to bring the hue into roughly the right place. So really the only difficulty I had here was in the red. So while the video of me painting it plays along in the background, let's have a talk about why I'm making this, why it doesn't make sense, and why that's the point. So I run a podcast with my friend Paul Allen, that being the BackToTheBrush Podcast, and you can find a link in the description because that is extremely relevant here. As part of the podcast, we occasionally run a segment called the Ordo Redactus, which is where if someone's posted a comment correcting something we've said in one of our episodes, or given us more information about something we've said in one of our episodes, we can then include that in the next episode, which has the double purpose of correcting our mistakes, but also giving some of our viewers the nice feeling of being included in an episode. And yet that doesn't make sense for the Ordo Redactus. Surely that would be the Ordo Errata. And to explain that and why, let's talk about the Ordo Redactus and the Ordo Errata, and what an Ordo is to begin with. I mentioned the Inquisition earlier as a bundle of individuals with ultimate power going around trying to make sure that the Imperium doesn't fall apart. And as a whole, the Inquisition is very much decentralized. And because of that, sub-organisations, philosophies and ideologies pop up all the time. Now there are 3 sub-factions that have grown to dominance, to the point where most people think there are only 3. Those 3 being the Ordo Xenos, Ordo Hereticus and Ordo Malleus, that deal with aliens, heretics and demons respectively. However, there are, as you would expect, an endless number of other smaller factions interwoven and all sorts of groups, ranging down to an individual loose cannon off on their own agenda. 2 of the lesser known but still quite widespread Ordos are the Ordo Errata and the Ordo Redactus. The purview of the Ordo Errata is to check on information and correct it. If there is some missing information, to fill it in. If something is incorrect, to replace it with what is correct. And this can range from ancient legends to modern day trade agreements, from the mystical to the extremely practical. And so as they are correcting information, you would think that on our podcast we would use that for the correcting information segment. But my humour doesn't work that way, because the minor order that we're talking about today is the Ordo Redactus, who are seemingly at odds with the Ordo Errata if you don't understand the full details of what's going on. The Ordo Redactus also goes through the vast information of the Imperium, from ancient scrolls to cutting-edge information documentation servitors, and everything in between. But rather than finding incorrect information and setting it straight, the Ordo Redactus sort of does the opposite, in finding dangerous or sensitive information and censoring it. Now sometimes this can be deleting it in such a way that it seems like it never existed in the first place, with no copies made at all. Sometimes information will be copied and passed to the Ordo Errata, but deleted on a particular world, and in other cases it's simply censored so that you need a high clearance level to be able to view that information, whatever it may be. And so by deliberately redacting the name of our Ordo Errata segment as the Ordo Redactus segment, that is entirely fitting with the backwards logic of the bureaucracy of the Imperium of the Warhammer 40k universe. And that is just too funny to not use for our podcast. So, how's the painting coming along? It's a little messy, but it's nearly there. I'll give the red yet another coat and I'll put some more white over the skull. And the last step is of particular importance, and that's to go around the edges and paint them all back into black. This will give some definition to the shape, but also make the edges of the red panels and the gold trim much more clean. So the finished product is, finished. My little Ordo Redactus Rosette. It's not properly a rosette, but we've talked about the lore and how I'm ignoring it deliberately, and that's the joke. So if you're interested in our podcast where we do the Ordo Redactus whenever we make a mistake, you can check out BackToTheBrush Podcast, which will be linked in the description. And that just leaves me to say, I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.